I hadn't flown in years. 8 hours across the country with 2 layovers, 1 flight delay, and legs that no longer liked to fold. But I came. I came because I promised Tobias before he passed that I would never miss Elias's big day, no matter what. The vineyard shimmered in the California sun, all stone archways and roses clipped to perfection. Guests milled about in gowns the color of polished metal, sipping from crystal flutes. I looked down at my navy dress pressed the night before in a hotel room iron and adjusted my pearl clip. Tobias had given it to me on our 30th anniversary. It still held. No one was at the entrance. No familiar faces. I walked in alone, clutching a small gift bag inside a silver watch we'd saved for Elias since his christening. A staff member looked confused when I gave my name. After a hushed exchange with someone near the catering tent, she motioned me forward. "This way, ma'am." I followed. Past the decorative archway, past the shaded dining area, past the live quartet. She gestured to a single white chair near a side wall, beside a stack of folded linens and a yellow "Caution Wet" floor sign. The air reeked faintly of bleach and lemon polish. I stood there for a moment, unsure if this was a misunderstanding. Before I could speak, I heard heels clicking behind me. Celeste. She wore cream silk and a tight smile. "We weren't sure you'd make it, Odette," she said. "Long trip for someone your age." Her eyes flicked toward the chair. "That should be fine for you, right out of the way." "Is there a reason I'm not with the family?" I asked gently. Celeste leaned in. "Because that's not the image we're presenting today." That old beggar look she gave a dismissive glance at my shoes might ruin the photos. I turned to leave. There was nothing more to say. But before I took my second step, her hand struck my cheek fast and sharp. "You don't walk away from my event," she hissed. "You don't belong here." No one moved. Alden stood across the patio, pretending to check his watch. Elias was nowhere in sight. I held my chin high, turned slowly, and walked toward the gravel path that curved behind the main building. The wind caught the edge of my scarf, and I let it go. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I made my way past the parking circle, away from the music and clinking glasses. I followed the path Tobias and I had once walked before it was lined with lavender and polished signs. The bench by the garden wall still sat under the same olive tree, its bark older now, but still upright. I sat slowly, the cool stone grounding me. The slap still stung, but not in the way Celeste intended. It wasn't humiliation that lingered, it was clarity. I hadn't come to be honored. I had come to keep a promise. Tobias used to say, "The day they forget who you are, you'll remind them quietly." He believed in that kind of reckoning, not loud, not cruel, just undeniable. A low hum broke the silence. A black car rolled up the side path, slow and sure. The rear passenger door opened before it came to a full stop. Edmund stepped out, adjusted his cap, and met my eyes like he always did, with respect, not pity. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle, "the jet is ready whenever you are. Shall I prepare the departure?" I shook my head. Not just yet. I stood and brushed a dry leaf from my hem. "Let's take a walk. I haven't visited this land in too long." Edmund gave a small nod, fell in step behind me. We passed the old barrel shed the ridge where Tobias had planted the first vine with his bare hands. The family thought the land had changed hands years ago after his passing. It had technically, but only into my name. They never asked who the silent partner was. Too busy building their image to look into the roots holding it up. As we reached the back fence line, I paused. The wind caught the edge of the valley, and for a moment I could smell the early grapes. Tobias used to say that truth, like wine, takes time to rise. I looked toward the banquet tent across the lawn, where strangers toasted beneath borrowed lights. My hands stayed still, But inside me, something was beginning to shift. Edmund, I said, go to the car. Bring the envelope. 3 years ago, I lay in a hospital bed with wires at my chest and a mask on my face, watching shadows move across the ceiling tiles. Pneumonia. It nearly took me. The nurses were kind. The chaplain checked in once, but my son never came. No flowers, no phone calls. I asked the front desk twice if there'd been any messages. They just shook their heads. One young nurse, soft-eyed and apologetic, mentioned a woman, sharp voice, expensive coat, who called and said the family was monitoring things from afar. Celeste. Later I learned she'd intercepted my mail, my lawyer's letters. She'd told Alden I didn't want visitors. Told the hospital I was confused. She said it with a smile, I imagine. The kind of smile that turns ice into protocol. 2 weeks after I was discharged, I found the photocopy of a document she'd filed a medical affidavit claiming I was no longer of sound mind. Alden signed it. My son. My only child. The same boy I once walked 6 miles to pick up from school when the bus broke down. The same man who now signed me away. I didn't yell. I didn't sue. I didn't confront them. I rewrote my will. I met with Tobias's old lawyer in a quiet office 2 towns over. We set up a trust in a name they wouldn't recognize. I transferred the deed, the investments, even the small lake cabin I hadn't visited in 10 years. The lawyer asked who the beneficiary would be. I gave him my own name for now. Until I decided. Today, I have. I stepped back onto the vineyard path as Edmund returned the envelope in his gloved hands. Sealed, embossed, notarized. Inside the legal fire they'll never see coming. They thought I'd forget, I said quietly. That I'd fade. Edmund didn't respond. He never did when silence said more than comfort. We walked past the wine cellar, its doors closed now, but still breathing the air of Tobias's barrels. The stones beneath my feet felt steadier than they had in years. Across the yard, music swelled under the white tent again. Laughter, toasts, crystal clinking. I looked down at the envelope, then ahead at the people who'd locked me out of a life I built. It's time, I said, and we kept walking. The sun was slipping low behind the hills as I returned to the edge of the celebration. From the outside, it looked like a painting, linen-covered tables, amber light catching the curve of every glass. The string quartet played a lullaby of luxury, but beneath it all, I could feel the tension, the brittle layer of performance that cracked the moment truth walked in. I stood just beyond the arbor, invisible to most. Celeste stood on the raised platform, mic in hand, laughing at her own joke. Her voice echoed across the lawn. And as we toast to Elias and Charlotte, to legacy and vision, I stepped forward. Why is the man who built this land seated beside trash bins? My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The music died mid-note. Conversations froze. Chairs creaked as heads turned toward me. Celeste's smile flickered. She blinked like she hadn't quite registered the interruption. Excuse me, you heard me. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Isn't that his grandmother?" I took another step forward. This vineyard, this family exists because Tobias Hargrave built it with his hands. He poured his life into this soil. And today, his memory was seated beside mop buckets and a fan vent. Was that your idea of respect? Celeste descended the steps, each movement sharper than the last. You've had your moment, she said tightly. Please leave. I'm asking a question, I said steady. Not for drama, for clarity. She didn't answer. Instead, her hand shot out. The slap landed across my cheek loud as a dropped wine glass. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. One man stood halfway, then sat back down. Alden didn't move. You don't belong here, she hissed. You never did. She turned to the nearest staff member. Escort her out. Now. The young man hesitated, eyes darting between us. It's fine, I said, brushing my coat smooth. I know the way. I turned and walked, not hurried, not ashamed. The slap had been meant to drive me out like a stain on porcelain. But all it did was confirm what I already knew. No one stopped me. Not my son. Not my grandson. Not one guest who had once shaken my hand or kissed my cheek at Christmas. At the back gate, Edmund waited beside the car. His hands were folded, his posture straight. "Everything ready?" I asked. He nodded once. The music behind us resumed louder now, as if volume could drown what had just happened. And then we both looked up at the sky just in time to hear it. That sound, low, steady, nearing. My jet had arrived. The tires on the Rolls-Royce had barely cooled when Edmund opened the door. I stepped out slowly, not with hesitation, but with intention. My heels touched the gravel like punctuation. Behind me, the two men in dark suits adjusted their cuffs and waited for my nod. I gave it once, and we began walking toward the main lawn. The air had changed. It no longer carried the sharp, artificial scent of forced celebration. Now it felt like something had cracked open. We passed the outer gardens, then the service tents. Guests were seated once more, napkins draped across laps, wine glasses filled. The quartet had resumed a soft instrumental. No one saw me coming until I stepped through the arbor. I didn't have to raise my voice. My presence was louder than anything a microphone could carry. Celeste's voice trailed off mid-sentence as she stood at the platform holding a glass aloft. And with all our hearts, we then silence. Her eyes landed on me. Her face, painted and polished just an hour ago, seemed to pale under the weight of recognition. Alden sat beside her, already sinking in his chair, his jaw locked. Elias, further down the head table, rose instinctively. I reached for the mic. Celeste didn't resist. She stepped back like the ground itself had shifted under her heels. "I won't be long," I said. My voice was steady, not cold. This land, this vineyard was Tobias's dream. He planted it with his hands. I funded it with mine. And while you may have forgotten who built this place, I never stopped watching. I opened the envelope Edmund had carried. Inside was the notarized deed, signed and sealed, declaring the vineyard's true ownership, the Hargrave Family Trust, under my name. The papers were dated 2 years ago, legally binding and irrefutable. Celeste let out a short, breathy laugh. "You think this means anything?" I turned to her. "It means everything." Elias stepped toward me. "Grandma." His voice was softer than I remembered. "I didn't know." "I know," I said. "You weren't supposed to." I looked out over the guests. Most stared at the documents in my hands. A few looked away, embarrassed. One woman set down her wine and folded her arms. Another whispered something to her husband. I didn't need their approval. I wasn't here for vindication. I was here because they needed to see what dignity looked like when it stood its ground. I returned the papers to the envelope and lowered the mic. Across the lawn, past the trellis, and just beyond the flowering shrubs, I saw her waiting, Lucia, still wearing her apron, her arms crossed over her chest, just like the day she promised she'd keep my secrets safe. I nodded once. She nodded back. It was time. Lucia met me just past the slope where the trellis gave way to earth. The guests were still murmuring behind us, but their voices were like distant wind, nothing I needed to carry. She was already out of breath from climbing the ridge, her apron dusted with soil, her hands streaked with grape sap. She didn't speak right away, just looked at me with something between relief and quiet fire. "You did it," she said finally. "No," I replied. "Not yet." She reached into the side of her work apron and pulled out a folded envelope, rubber-banded and slightly crumpled. "I saved what I could," she said. "They tried to shred the rest." I took it from her, gently sliding off the band. Inside were copies of Tobias's old harvest logs, familiar handwriting, red ink annotations, crisp numbers written with care. I ran my thumb along the top sheet, recognizing the slant in his script, the way he used to abbreviate Sira with a looping S. They were rewriting everything, Lucia continued. Celeste told the branding consultant that legacy was dated, said they needed something clean, global, something without sentiment. I almost laughed. Tobias used to say sentiment was the only thing worth bottling. Lucia unfolded a second sheet, a sleek, color-printed proposal. Hargrave Estates rebranded. Minimalist label mock-ups. Buzzwords like lifestyle-focused urban palettes, heritage optional. And nowhere was my name. Or his. They erased the vineyard map from the archive, she said it was too cluttered, too handmade. I reached into my coat and pulled out a different envelope. One Edmund had found in Tobias's study, weeks after the funeral, still sealed in wax. I hadn't opened it. Not until the week before I flew out. Inside was a map hand-drawn. Tobias's vineyard plan, down to the last irrigation line. Each varietal block marked with dates, spacing, light exposure. I'd seen hundreds of versions over the years, but this one had something the others didn't. At the bottom right corner in his firm, unshaken script were 3 words, Odette's line. It marked the southern slope where the soil ran deep and the vines always matured, just a little ahead of the rest. I never knew he wrote that, I said. Lucia gave a tight smile. He told me once it was his favorite part of the land. Said it carried your steadiness. I folded the map slowly, tucking it back into its envelope like a prayer. They planned to pave over it, Lucia added. Use it for an outdoor spa. I stared out toward the ridge. The vines swayed in the early wind. No one else may have remembered what that patch meant, but Tobias had. And now I would make sure everyone did. From down below, the sound of string instruments rose again. The wedding march had resumed. The chairs had been reset. The aisle scattered with petals, and the air carried that hushed, hopeful stillness weddings always seemed to demand. The officiant stood beneath the floral arch voice, smooth and practiced. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here, too I stood. There will be no vows today, I said, calm as the morning fog. Not on broken soil. The officiant blinked, unsure if I was part of the program. Guests twisted in their seats. Some leaned forward, others leaned back as if retreating might spare them involvement. A few rows in, Elias stood slowly. His boutonniere trembled slightly as he walked toward me, his steps slow but sure. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand. He just asked, "Are you stopping this for revenge?" I looked at him, the boy who once built birdhouses with Tobias, who used to sit on my lap and beg for one more story before bed. He was older now, worn down in places I hadn't noticed until today. "No," I said softly, "for restoration." The officiant held his book a moment longer, then closed it with both hands. The soft thud echoed across the lawn. A gasp broke the silence. Celeste shot up from her seat, eyes wild. "This is outrageous!" she spat, turning to Alden. "Do something!" But Alden didn't move. His mouth opened, then shut, as if the weight of 3 years of silence had finally caught up with him. Celeste hissed something beneath her breath, clutched her handbag, and stormed down the aisle heels, stabbing the earth with every step. Alden followed slower, glancing back once. I didn't return it. Elias remained beside me, unsure of where to stand or what to say. He didn't defend his parents, but he didn't protest either. His silence for the first time wasn't cowardice. It was listening. Around us, no one clapped. No one rose. They just sat. Shoulders tight. Fingers resting on glasses never lifted. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say. I turned from the arch and walked toward the stone path that led back to the vineyard's edge. Each step forward felt lighter than the last, as though the weight I'd carried had finally begun to lift. And waiting there, just beyond the trellis, was the bench Tobias built with his bare hands. The far edge of the vineyard had always been forgotten. Years of overgrowth cracked stone lavender bushes too wild to trim without gloves. Tobias used to call it his favorite place, not because it was tidy, but because no one ever pretended there. It was where he'd go when he needed the world to quiet. Weeks after the wedding that never was, I began clearing it. Not with workers or equipment, but with my own hands. Edmund brought down pails of water. Lucia trimmed what could be salvaged. We carried stone from the old wine shed, set it in a loose ring, and planted rosemary where the soil stayed warm in the morning light. I named it Tobias Garden. Not for the vineyard. Not for show. Just for us. One morning, Elias arrived, not in a pressed suit or behind tinted windows, but in worn shoes and a plain shirt. Beside him stood a woman I didn't recognize. Dark curls, gentle eyes, hands that looked like they'd worked with soil. "This is Lonnie," he said. "She's the one who stayed when everything fell apart." Lonnie offered a quiet nod. I heard there was a garden worth helping. We sat together on the stone bench while the wind moved softly between the vines. Elias told me about the investors, pulling out about the letters his mother sent blaming everyone but herself. I listened without responding. Finally, he looked up. "I want to rebuild this place the right way, with your name on it, with your story told." I looked at him carefully, searching his face for performance, for convenience, but there was none. "Not my story," I said. "Just the truth. And truth doesn't need a spotlight, just space." He nodded. That was enough. Later that afternoon, after they'd gone, I returned to the center of the garden. The stone table Tobias had built from salvaged pieces of the old patio stood solid in the middle. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the small brass plate Lucia had engraved. I knelt, pressed it into place, and tightened the screws with a slow, steady turn. The engraving caught the light as the sun dipped low behind the hills. Reserved for the woman who was once seated by the mop closet. No announcement, no audience. Just the wind, the vines, and the quiet certainty that I no longer needed a seat at their table. I'd built my own.